so this is that Star Wars game with that waifu meme in it.
Your feelings for her are not real. They are real to me!
So Star Wars The Force Unleashed 2 is a third-person hack and slash game where you play as Starkiller, who used to be one of the most powerful characters in Star Wars until Disney bought the IP, and through these games in the non-canon section of the Star Wars universe. The sequel was coming off the fairly good success of the first game in the series, which even though it had some flaws was a good bit of Star Wars power fantasy fun, and had an ending that seemed to tie things up nicely. It didn't feel like there was much more that could be done with the story, but then at the 2009 Spike Video Game Awards, a reveal trailer dropped.
Foolishly, you hold to hope for the life you once had.
Let go of everything you fear to lose. You must.
You think you have a purpose, a destiny.
Uncertain and fearful you are.
You are but a shadow of your former self.
Confused you have become.
Weak and misguided.
Hide not from yourself.
Accept the certainty
Confront your fear.
that all is lost.
Will I ever see you again?
So we got Darth Vader and Yoda talking like disapproving mentors in Starkiller's head, which is obviously making him forcefully upset. And the only thing that calms him down is the voice of Juno Eclipse, his crush from the last game. I wonder where the story's going to go. Anyway, the trailer tries to keep the spirit of the last game going by showing something over the top compared to regular Star Wars. Well, the older Star Wars stuff, I mean. With a Rancor casually being thrown towards Starkiller by an even bigger creature called a Gorog. Because more is better, right? So I'll admit this trailer got me interested and gave me quite a few questions, like how is Starkiller still alive? Is the trailer implying that he's going to be trained by Yoda at some point in the game? And why are Rancors so mistreated in Star Wars? Well, the answer to the first question is that he might not be Starkiller, but a clone of him created by Darth Vader. Or maybe he's not a clone of him. It's a bit vague in the story, but we'll get into that later. As you can tell from the trailer, they were going for a more darker tone. The reason for this was this sequel is going to be the Empire Strikes Back of the Force Unleashed games, which is a fairly high goal to aim for, being that the Empire Strikes Back is considered by some as the best Star Wars movie ever. I'm more into Return of the Jedi, but nobody's perfect. Okay, so how much development time were they going to give this Force Unleashed sequel, so that it could match the storytelling quality of the Empire Strikes Back? 9 months. Yeah, that's right, this game was developed in 9 months, which by the standards of AAA games is really short. Now the reason for this ultra short development time is that when new management came in at LucasArts, they wanted to maximize profits by doing genius things like reducing the game's budget even though the first game had sold 6 million copies, and laying off staff because why would you want to keep around experienced people who knew how to make games that can sell over 6 million copies? Where had this new management worked before to get these genius short-term profit ideas? Okay, that explains everything. So with all this going for the game, how did it turn out? Well, maybe before I give my opinions, let's talk about how it runs. So like the previous game, it was mostly made to run on consoles, but they did release the game on PC at launch this time. But after the technical issues from the last game, I was mostly mentally prepared to run into some problems. Though not prepared enough it seems, because this game has way more issues than the first game. First off, the game crashes a lot, and there doesn't seem to be a way to fix this. So you're gonna have to deal with that for most of your time playing. Also, there was a screen tearing issue when I first started up the game, which you can fix by putting the game into windowed mode. Then the cutscenes didn't want to play, and the fix for that was to change my PC's default media player to the Windows media player, and change the cutscene files to WMV ones, which mostly worked until there was a section in the game where it didn't want to progress past a certain point as it kept crashing. The way to fix this is to deactivate the game's cutscenes in the config file before starting the bug level and then reactivating them after. Only to find that after that level the game's frame rate dropped drastically and started bugging out a bit, though this problem was fixed with just a restart of the game. So to say this game has issues is a bit of an understatement. Half the challenge of this game is just getting it to run. But maybe there's some great gameplay or story hidden under this garbage pile of problems. We'll get to that in a bit, but first let's talk about the visuals and sound. The in-game visuals are improved from the previous game, and there are a few options for graphics this time, though the lack of a VSync option did cause issues like I mentioned earlier. It looks nice and all, and you can even dismember enemies now. The problem is that those visuals are probably one of the few nice things I'm going to say about this game. And the music is still good, but that's because the game uses a soundtrack from the movies, which is cheating a little, which I would use too if I could. Anyway, the game's cutscenes look like a step down from the previous game, as they feel like they're from a more generic action game with some Star Wars bits thrown in. I mean, they aren't bad or anything, they just feel like they're missing a bit of extra polish and quality the previous game had. They do try to include more in-game cutscenes this time around. Most of the time they work pretty well, and other times, oof. Also, Starkiller's new run animation is really odd to me. It's almost like he kinda has a slight waddle in his run now. Maybe Vader hasn't perfected that cloning process. Some other downgrades include how lightsaber crystal colors are now linked to their effects. So now you don't get to choose what color you want and add the desired effect like the previous game. It's now if you want that effect, you're stuck with the color. I know it's only a little bit of customization, but it does annoy me. Speaking of lightsabers, to emphasize this was a bigger and better sequel, all of a sudden Starkiller wields 2 lightsabers now. No reason is given, he just wields 2 lightsabers now, just because. I mean, it's cool and everything, everything, but if he's the original or clone with memories from the first game, wouldn't he use the same fighting style as before? Or maybe it's a subtle hint that he's an imperfect clone of Starkiller, like that water walk, but for whatever reason you get to use 2 lightsabers in this game. Can't imagine what they would have done in a third game. Maybe Starkiller would have to wield lightsabers like General Grievous or something. Anyway, how's the gameplay compared to the first game? Well, let's start with the good. They did manage to improve the targeting for force powers a fair bit, and they included a new force power, the Jedi Mind Trick, which is fun to use as it either turns the enemy against each other or just makes them jump to their death. Also, there's this new superpowered mode called Force Fury, which overcharges Starkiller's force abilities even beyond their already ridiculous levels, with increased damage. And in this mode you don't even use melee really, you just move your lightsabers around with the force. It's kind of fun, but we've gotten to the point of maybe too much more is better design here. They did try to improve combat a bit with some new mech enemies that are mostly immune to force powers, and if you try to get close for melee they just beat you down. You have to use their own projectiles against them, like the Carbonite mech where you have to catch one of its Carbonite bombs and throw it back at it, which will freeze it long enough for you to get close and get some hits in. This is a good mechanic, but it gets overused and gets repeated over and over to the point that it gets tedious. There are variations in this enemy type, but it's not enough of a change to keep it interesting. Also, you kind of have to wait around a little sometimes for them to do the projectile thing, so you can hit them or do damage to them, which slows combat down. Oh, and add in the quick time events that were already a little overused in the first game, and it all makes it a slog to get through. It doesn't feel empowering, it's more like just something you get through so you can make progress. Speaking of a slog, the boss fights in this game are a grind to get through. In the first game they were a fair challenge, but now the fights are way too drawn out with way too many phases, and they go for spectacle rather than actual good gameplay. It's a pretty strong hint that this game was made in 9 months. As you could probably tell, LucasArts were trying to squeeze as much gameplay out of what little they had. Also, I think they may have overlooked how easy it is to beat enemies with a grapple, as there were times I could beat multiple enemies in a row just by grabbing them. I mean, the only real joy I got out of the gameplay was zapping flying enemies with force lightning and just seeing where they ended up. Okay, so the gameplay is a bit of a mess. How does the story shape up? Going in, I wasn't expecting amazing storytelling, just something in line with the first game, which was solid but maybe a bit over the top. But remember, LucasArts wanted this game to be the Empire Strikes Back of this series, which I'm gonna say right off the bat, it isn't. There are a few things that don't work so well, which is probably to blame on the short development time, and people leaving the dev team while the game was still being made. The story is kind of just thrown together at points and feels like a rushed first draft that needed a fair bit more work on it. Like, you can kind of see what they were trying to do with the story, which is focus on what Starkiller wants after the end of the previous game, while adding in that he's dealing with the fact that he may be a clone with someone else's memories. Now, what is obvious from the start of the game is that Starkiller has strong feelings for Juno, and is trying to get back to her for most of the game, which if you look at it from his perspective kind of makes sense, because think about it. His entire life he was trained to be a ruthless killer and kept hidden from everyone, so he probably had very little chance to form feelings for anyone.
How many pilots have you lost before me?
7.
The previous game was probably the first time he ever had a crush, and she reciprocated. So he probably doesn't know how to deal with those emotions. That's probably what's going on in his mind, and why he wants to find her above everything else.
Juno! Where is she?
But from the player's perspective, this guy just seems really obsessed with the girl, and wants to get back to her no matter what, at the cost of almost anything, including the rebellion he helped build in the last game. He doesn't seem to care about the current state of the rebels, or really stopping the Empire at all, which gets shown over and over again in the story.
Oh, it's a very long story. Captain Eclipse and Senator Organa, they found
Juno! Where's Juno?
Starkiller, I know you want to find Juno, but we need your help. One Jedi could turn the tide of any war.
I'm only here for Juno, General.
Blast it! We need you on the front line!
It isn't engaging, and the story is also rushed. And I'm not saying you couldn't do this type of story, because giving a character flaws in the story is way more interesting than making them act perfectly in all situations. They managed to do this in the last game, with how Starkiller was trying to redeem himself after he did some pretty bad things. But it is a hard thing to balance, which the story doesn't do well. It doesn't do a good job of showing why Starkiller is so focused on Juno above everything else. Like, maybe they could have done flashbacks of how he never had a chance to form attachments through his long years of training under Vader, or anything to help set up why he acts the way he does in this game. Instead, we get...
I'm only here for Juno, General.
It makes it hard to relate to him, which it shouldn't be considering I think nearly everyone has had a crush at some point. So I'm gonna go more into the story now. If you don't want spoilers, then go to here. Okay, so Star Wars scroll and we find out the galaxy is not doing so hot again. A civil war is looming with the end of the last game as the rebellion is gaining steam, but General Kota, Starkiller's former Jedi mentor, has been captured by the Empire, which for some reason just makes the rest of the rebellion fleet just stop doing rebel stuff. I mean, I'm pretty sure there were plenty other rebel leaders to pick up the slack with one of them gone. Anyway, Darth Vader's also been up to some stuff, mainly trying to fix the oopsie of making a rebellion with his apprentice in the last game. His solution is to clone Starkiller and get him to destroy the rebellion he created, though this plan hasn't been going so well. Starkiller's clone hasn't been cooperating with Vader's plan, and keeps having memory flashbacks about past events and feelings Starkiller had. This also suggests that this maybe isn't a clone of Starkiller, but just a revised Starkiller trying to be convinced he's a clone. Though Vader tries to shut this down by saying it's all just memory implants for your training. So get on with killing everything the real Starkiller cared about or loved, which will include the captured General Kota once his training is complete. Starkiller, however, during his training can't kill the hologram droid of Juno. Vader sees this as a failure, and we all know how Vader deals with failure. But Starkiller has a memory flashback of that one time Vader betrayed him and decides, yeah, it's time to escape. Which he does with a dramatic jump out a window. Starkiller battles his way across Camino and eventually finds Vader's personal starfighter and steals it to make his escape. Remembering what Vader told him about General Kota being captured, he heads off to go rescue him. Kota isn't doing so hot since he's been fighting for days in an arena for the amusement of a local Imperial governor. Landing on Nemoidia, Starkiller tries to pretend that he's been sent by Vader to come collect Kota, but the governor doesn't buy it, which results in Starkiller having to fight his way to Kota, which has Starkiller facing off against a bunch of enemies and a gunship boss thing that you fight one too many times on the way to the arena. Like I said, it's a slog. Once Starkiller finally makes it to the arena to rescue Kota, who's happy to hear his voice, the governor decides to send out the level's final boss, which of course needs to be bigger than anything that's come before, even a Rancor, because more is better. Again, this fight has way too many boss phases, which is kind of a repeat of the worst boss fight in the first game where you brought down a Star Destroyer over a long drawn out fight. At least the governor gets eaten in between one of the boss phases, so progress I guess. The final phase has Starkiller falling to the planet while he battles the Gorog to free Kota, who's being held by it like King Kong holding his date. Starkiller eventually finishes it off with a Superman dive through the chest, which frees Kota, who conveniently summons a ship to save them from the fall. Entering the ship, Starkiller is disappointed to find that Juno isn't there, and Kota says he doesn't know where she is, because he lost contact with a ship that was with the Rebel fleet. So she's probably with the Rebel fleet, right? But before we think too logically about this and go straight to the Rebel fleet, Kota and Starkiller argue about him being a clone or not, which Kota thinks is impossible because Jedi can't be cloned, though the mentioning of that Imperial clone facility gives Kota the idea that if they strike there, it'll help rally the entire rebellion into action. As Kota argues with Starkiller to help with the rebels, he gets annoyed with Starkiller wanting to meditate and think about things, which is kind of odd for a Jedi Master of all people to get annoyed about, but Kota's always been a bit of an aggressive Jedi, so I guess that's fine. This is when a part of the story, in my opinion, kinda gets forced in. While arguing with Starkiller, Kota randomly mentions the caves of Dagobah, which makes Starkiller want to go there. If you're a Star Wars nerd like me, then you know what's coming next. Yeah, it's time to go visit Yoda. And it does nothing to help the story. This is just a really short level for a Yoda cameo, and an excuse to have Force visions like Luke did in The Empire Strikes Back. Also, they throw in a cameo from Boba Fett talking to Vader about taking some stealth Imperial troops to help capture Juno to lure Starkiller back to Vader. Starkiller doesn't actually fight Boba Fett in this game, he's just here like a
Bantha. Yes? Maybe not.
All of these cameos are trying to give this game some of the Empire Strikes Back vibes, which it doesn't in my opinion, they just feel forced in. The first game did this much better by being a bit more subtle about it, sometimes, and it making sense for the story. Mostly. But in this game, you can literally take out the whole level of Starkiller visiting Yoda on Dagobah and having that Force Vision thing with Juno coming under attack. And it wouldn't change the story at all, it's just here because more. It's the same with Boba Fett, you could literally have the stealth troopers go and get her and it wouldn't change the story. Though to be fair, Boba Fett doesn't do much in the original trilogy other than stand around and look cool, but you get my point. Anyway, Starkiller and Kota head to the Rebel fleet where Juno is. While Kota talks about how the Rebel leaders aren't doing anything, the only thing on Starkiller's mind is,
have you told her that I'm with you?
So they talk a bit more and Starkiller decides to give Kota the location of the clone facility so the rebels can attack it. But doesn't commit to helping, he just wants to see Juno. This is when the rebel fleet comes under attack from those new Imperial stealth troopers who remind me of General Grievous a little, which has Starkiller making his way through the ship to try and get to Juno before them. She however gets captured by Boba Fett, who escapes with her to Camino. Starkiller tells Kota to order the rebels to attack Camino so he can go rescue Juno. One thing I find funny but a bit odd about this scene is the enemy boss for the level is just like sneaking around in the background. Like he came into work late and just realizes he needs to get back to the boss arena before anyone notices. Why not just have the boss fight there? So Starkiller chases after it and after a not too lengthy fight, well, for this game, beats it just in time for the rebels to commence their attack on Camino, which the Empire is ready for. They even have shields up around the clone facility. But Starkiller comes up with a very cunning plan of just crashing the ship into the facility to break the shields.
Abandoned ship! Abandoned ship!
Which leads to a little bit of ridiculousness as Starkiller moves large pieces of wrecked ships in orbit out of the way with the force so the ship can make its way to the surface. I'll admit it's a pretty cool scene once he gets out of the falling ship as it crashes into the facility, but then I noticed another weird thing. As the ship crashes, a bunch of TIE fighters come out of the explosion, like how does that work? Though don't think about it too much, because now Starkiller manages to land and starts wrecking his way through the facility to get to Juno. While doing that he keeps getting asked for help from Kota, which he does sort of, but only because it helps him make progress towards Juno. As they chat back and forth with each other, you really get the sense that Starkiller doesn't really care about anything going on around him.
I know how you feel about her, but she's just one officer. We're going to lose the entire rebellion if you don't help us.
I'm sorry. I just can't.
He just wants Juno, which is a stark difference from the previous game where he's willing to sacrifice himself for the rebellion. I mean, you can see the parallels in the story with The Empire Strikes Back where Luke is only focused on rescuing his friends, but it's not at the expense of everything around him. He's just being impatient with becoming a Jedi strong enough to take on Vader. And that problem doesn't exist here in The Force Unleashed. Starkiller is more than capable of taking on Vader to rescue Juno and helping the rebels. It's like a false conflict of choice of doing one or the other, and the story is weaker because of it. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. Starkiller makes his way through the facility and gets Force visions of Vader on the way to fight him for some reason. And eventually he confronts Vader in the heart of the cloning facility. This fight has multiple stages and it has you fighting against incomplete clones of Starkiller. It repeats its stages a little too much, but eventually Starkiller makes progress, which forces Vader to threaten to kill Juno, which makes Starkiller bend the knee to do whatever he wants. Though Juno takes the chance to strike at Vader, who dodges it easily and overacts by throwing her a mile through a window, which maybe kills her. Starkiller doesn't react well to this. So the fight continues with multiple stages until Starkiller quick time events his way to victory over Vader, where we finally get the waifu meme.
Your feelings for her are not real.
They are real to me!
Also, Kodo rushes in to tell Starkiller not to kill Vader as they can still get information from him. This is where Starkiller gets the choice to kill Vader or spare him. If you try to kill him, then a dark side clone of Starkiller magically appears and saves Vader and kills the rebels. If you choose to spare him, then the rebels take him prisoner and magically Juno comes back to life. Starkiller then chats a bit to Vader about how he's broken his hold of him, and the game ends with Starkiller and Juno flying off for future adventures. But not until the game takes another scene from The Empire Strikes Back with Boba Fett following them. To put it lightly, The Force Unleashed 2 is a bit of a mess. The gameplay, story, and even how it runs are not great, which is probably the effect of bad decisions made by management of the time, which for me resulted in a fairly disappointing sequel. This could have been a pretty good step up for the first game, as it had a pretty solid base to work off of. It just needed the support and resources to do it, but decisions made to rush it out pretty much ruined any chance of that happening. Some people still want to see a Force Unleashed 3, which I kinda understand since they'd want to know what eventually happens to Starkiller. Though with this series now considered non-canon and the disaster that was the sequel, I kinda don't see that happening, though anything is possible. I'd be fine with either the first game just being remembered as a fun what-if story, as by itself it does wrap things up mostly without needing the sequel, or maybe a remake that's more in line with current Star Wars canon, though that would be hard to do with how over the top the game is. But hey, other non-canon stuff has been brought back, so maybe there's a little hope. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, consider subscribing. See you next time.